Today, under the debt volcano. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to the latest post covering finance and problem news with a distinctively Australian flavour. And today I'm joined again by Eddie Hobbs from Ireland. Hello, Eddie.
Good morning or good evening there, Martin. How are you?
It's safe to say good day. Yeah, I'm very good.
Right.
How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Now, you were very kind to spend some time with me a couple of months ago and discussing specifically some of the leading indicators that led up to the Irish financial crisis. And at that stage, there were amazing resonances with what's going on down here in Australia. Things have sort of moved on a bit, and I thought it would be good just to sort of catch up and perhaps do a slightly deeper dive into some of those early warning signs that we seem to be seeing here now, and also just explore a bit further what this might mean for Australia, because it does look to me as though we are following the Irish path quite closely now.
Well, I mean, you've been looking at the data in Australia. I can only draw the comparisons over here as that data is revealed. There would be worrying signs that there is now a disconnect between what is coming out from the establishment and what is actually happening on the ground, and there's a lag between the sort of indicators that the RBA and others examine and anecdotally what's beginning to appear on the ground in different locations, and that's reflective of what happened here as well, where it was quite clear from the, shall we say, less scientific measures that all was not well. I mean, there was local actors quite clear long before it evolved into official data that Ireland was getting into deep trouble. And at the time, this was happening during the sunshine period when, there was unemployment growth, everything seemed to be fine. We were getting clearance from the IMF, as I said the last time, that everything was fine, but it wasn't fine. And how deeply that transplants into the Australian experience is something really for you and others in Australia to consider. I can only comment really on what happened over here. But one of the things that I thought we might focus a little bit on in this discussion, Martin, with your with your permission, is that is really how Ireland was overwhelmed by the scale of the problems that arose, both financially and socially. Now, the media focus was very largely on the national insolvency, and rather not on what was happening at the grassroots. And that really didn't become apparent for several years. There was a lot of private suffering going on, and a lot of that was directly linked to the complete inability of the national infrastructure, let's call it the insolvency infrastructure, to cope with a mass insolvency event. And I know little about the Australian insolvency model, but I can only guess that unless there had been a recent mass insolvency event, it's unlikely to be prepared or ready, resource-wise or rules-wise, to deal with the scale of what may be coming, where you have a very large number of people right in the middle of Australian society that simply are incapable of continuing to service their debts.
Yeah, and at the moment, the official statistics are that the amount of delinquency in the mortgage books is remarkably low, right? It's and the rating agencies are reporting that there are small rises, particularly 90-day plus defaults. But it seems to me that the official figures are probably not really getting at the real strife on the ground. So I measure mortgage stress, which is essentially looking at household cash flow. And we know we've not got more than 1 million households now who are really struggling with just the week in, week out grind. And this is at a time when the unemployment rate, of course, is sitting at a very low 5%, which is pretty remarkable. Moved up just slightly over the last few weeks.
Yeah.
But it feels to me as though we're probably a year or two ahead of really seeing all of that compression in terms of household finances, and therefore all the outworking of that in terms of defaults. A year or two away from that, I think it's probably quite early. But we're also now seeing pockets of difficulty in particular locations. So, for example, in some of the newly built suburbs in and around Sydney and Melbourne in particular, we're seeing more and more properties coming on the market under a forced sale. scenario. And of course, the first thing that happens, Eddie, then is that the price that people might get drops, considerably, because of course it's not a natural sale.
Well, that's exactly what happened here. It's a bit like a tsunami, or if you've ever read the book Isaac Storm about the drowning of Galveston, you get the same picture of early warnings being ignored by the established watchers. The tide begins to go out, and then suddenly this thing seems to come out of nowhere. But it's not coming out of nowhere; it's coming out of somewhere. And there's also, of course, quite understandably, because of the degree to which people are embedded positively as they see it in the upward only rising asset class story of property, both the government in terms of revenue, stamp duty, etc., and of course middle Australia in terms of growing its own prosperity. As I've consistently said, the closer to the precipice, the greater the deafness grows. And it's a remarkable thing to watch, and it's very hard to believe it unless you've been through it. That this is how it works. It's not an Irish thing. It's not an Australian thing. It's a human thing, and it seems to me that you're ticking the boxes again as we've ticked them. But what happened over here, Martin, really is that when the tsunami hit, all hands were to the pump to save the state. And the state is different to the people. I mean, the state is the establishment, and it's defined in a very different way to the people. And the people came second. So the state was saving itself, saving its privileges, saving its tax revenues, and bailing itself out. Finally, when the capitulation point came, and there was, the Troika loan was organised for Ireland. But really, the real issue wasn't the state. The state was always going to get sorted out, especially in the Irish case, because we were members of the Eurozone and so on. Now, there's a whole different story around the unfairness of how all that was done from an Irish perspective. But really, I'm not concerned about that. I'm very, very concerned about Middle Ireland, or in your case, Middle Australia, and what can be learned from that, because the strain comes on the chief member of the household. That's where the mental and financial strain comes on, and they crack under that kind of pressure. And you will say, well, what are the supports from the state, from the government, from the processes to deal with insolvency, to deal with the issue that people's balance sheets are upside down. They're going to be upside down for maybe 6 to 8 years or longer. Their incomes are falling. Unemployment happens. Businesses nosedive. The money physically isn't there to pay the demands that are coming in from banks. Banks begin to threaten people, legal action commences, and then you're falling back on what is the insolvency infrastructure designed to support all that? And over here, we had the tragedy of having none. So when the balloon went up in 2009, 2010, we were reliant on debt laws that went back into the Victorian period and earlier. And there had been nothing in the recent statute book designed to cope with a modern mass insolvency event. We then brought in the Insolvency Act in the Republic of Ireland in December 2012. It didn't become operational in 2013. That was many years after the event. So if you can imagine, from 2008 until 2013, there was nothing other than Dickensian approach to debt, to indebtedness. And that meant that your only recourse was bankruptcy, and bankruptcy took 12 years. Now, you can murder somebody in this country, and second-degree murder, if you want to call it that, and get out on good behaviour quicker than that. So, I mean, the approach to people who got themselves into this difficulty was to punish them, which was the laissez-faire hangover from the Victorian period, that if you couldn't manage your finances, somehow you were responsible, you were deficient, you needed to be punished. I mean, that's how the poor houses arose, and which were used throughout the course of when we were dealing with the fallout from the Irish famine. Families were separated into poor houses. If you couldn't pay your debts, you went into a poor house. And it was that mentality. We had that up until 2013. We then brought in the Insolvency Act, and I have to say, Martin, as I thought at the time, it was a stitch-up. And it was a stitch-up because the state itself, through the Department of Finance, was forced to take very substantial stakes in the main Irish banks. So Irish taxpayers' money went into the banks, you could argue, with the gun put to our head by the ECB and the EU to save the French and German banks who had lent the money to the Irish banks. So Irish taxpayers were bailed out, arguably bailed out the EU itself, bailed out the Eurozone. With a very, very substantial addition to the national debt. So the banks get saved, but the dynamic that changed then was that the state itself became a player on the other side of the balance sheet. So the state itself became the largest shareholder in the banks. So therefore, when the Insolvency Act came in my opinion, it was jimmied. It was, in other words, it was a stitch-up, and it ensured that in any of these arrangements that the power was still with the creditor. An overarching power not to agree to insolvency arrangements through the court system if they didn't wish. So the banks had a veto, and they've used that veto very successfully. So while there have been some growth in insolvency arrangements, we have 3 different levels. You have a thing called a debt relief notice, where it's a very small amount of debt is just written off by the court, for a few hundred euros, right through to insolvency arrangements, which can work out. There's 2 different kinds, whether they're secured or unsecured loans over 5 to 6 years. But the numbers that have gone through those processes relative to the number of people that have suffered from all of this is still very, very small, even by 2019 standards on the basis of the most recent documentation. Well, we also found, as we thought, the Insolvency Act itself had to be quickly dealt with again a few years later, when it became quite clear that the stitch-up was too much of a stitch-up. It was too obvious. They had to make it less obvious. So the bankruptcy process, which had been cut to 3 years, that was then cut to 1. But in reality, it takes 1 to 3 years to work through a bankruptcy situation here. But underneath all of that are thousands upon thousands of Irish families today whose balance sheets are still upside down, who owe millions and millions to Irish banks that can never be repaid. And yet these loans are appearing on the balance sheets of the banks as non-performing loans to a certain point. They're not appearing as bad debts, even though any examination of the underlying borrowers can see that they can never repay these loans. So there's a kind of a game of delusion going on. But the critical point for me, because I see it day to day still, is the stress and the damage that it has caused on families. So when the Insolvency Act came in 2013, and when it was launched by the agency, the state agency itself, I spoke directly to the chief of the Insolvency Agency, and I asked him, he reported to the Department of Finance, and I asked him if the Department of Finance had yet had a meeting with the Department of Health to come to a coordinated mental health and financial response, which is what was needed. And I may have been speaking Klingon to him. It just didn't happen, and it still hasn't happened. So, if there's anybody who listens to this podcast, Martin, who's engaged in policy formation or strategy, whether they're civil servants or politicians in Australia or people who can influence those people, I would say, look, you really need to prepare Plan B here. Whether you believe this is going to happen or not, have a Plan B ready, and that Plan B should contain, the best examples of the best insolvency models from throughout the world. Look at them, copy them, edit them, get them ready for Australian circumstances, and integrate them with a mental health response, where you save families from the type of destructions which occurs throughout families when these type of extreme stresses arise. And of course, you have to get the balance right between creditors and debtors. There is the whole moral hazard argument and all the rest of that will play out in the media, and you'll get some pretty extreme views dominating those type of discussions. But if you can go and do the footwork now, go and do the research now across those best models in the world and get it right. The Australian model, if it was prepared in time, could become the template for how you handle these things into the future for other countries to follow. But if you wait for the tsunami to hit, and then it hits, and then you're doing it as we did it during an existential crisis, it took arguably 5, 6, 7 years before the mechanisms came in place over here, and then it was too late. And then also we on the other side of it, we also have over here, Martin, a huge difficulty with banks being able to get possession of homes and get possession of houses. So and the argument made is that now means that the legacy of that is that we have very high margins now on new debts being created, new loans going out or going out at margins above the cost of funds that are the highest in Europe, because banks over here will argue, well, we can't get possession of the repossession of homes, so therefore we have to price that into new credit. So this requires some of the best banking brains and social brains in Australia to come together quietly and really have a look at what would happen to us here in Australia in the event of a mass insolvency event occurring in a short number of years. How could we cope, and what could we now do to plan for such an event?
Very interesting, Eddie. And after the first post that we put up, we had a number of conversations with a number of political people, both politicians and also various advisors, trying to get people to understand that, as you say, plan for the unexpected. You know, it may not happen, but you should be planning for it now, right? And basically, to a man and woman, the reaction was, there's no point, this is never going to happen in Australia, right? So that we've still got this amazing state of denial here as to the real state of play. In other words, the reality on the ground with real people struggling with real debts and, you know, real banks is disconnected completely from the political class and disconnected from the regulators as well, who don't think there's anything wrong. So it's actually very hard to try and get this conversation going, right, before the crisis. And that, for me, is probably one of the biggest dilemmas that I face all the time. So I get a lot of individuals saying, well, you know, what should we be doing? How should we be planning? And I say, well, there are things you can do in terms of individuals, you know, get the debt down, etc. But the more institutional stuff that you're touching on, which is procedurally, how do you deal with people who can't repay their loans? How do you deal with banks in that situation? How do you deal with the broader ramifications in terms of health and those things? Those are the issues that nobody wants to touch.
Well, but that's human. But there's always leaders underneath down there in the grassroots of the civil service and in the banks, and maybe perhaps not in the banks, but certainly on the other side of the fence that must be reading this material, must know that, look, we are in jeopardy here. No, you can argue about the level of jeopardy. Some people think it's very high, but they're in the minority. And most people just don't want to hear about it. I mean, that was the same over here. People just didn't want to hear. And that's very understandable, because the scale of what you're asking them to understand, a bit like climate change at the start, is just something that people don't want to hear. And then those that are bringing this message to them will either be dismissed or derided or attacked. Critically attacked as doomsayers and so on. But having said that, there have to be people inside in the RBA, inside in your civil service, in your equivalent Department of Finance, who've brains to burn and who know we have a problem here and are quietly now beginning to talk about it. They have to be there. It would be horrible to think that they weren't there. It transpired over here some years afterwards as evidence came out in various court processes and so on, that there were senior people inside in the Central Bank in Ireland and others that had written memos internally where they pointed out their severe concerns to those higher up, and they were just not acted upon. So they must be there, and they need to make their voices heard. But it does require leadership. So, for example, if you're say involved in the RBA at a senior level, and you were concerned that this was a real risk, this was real jeopardy, well, you have a choice. I mean, you can continue on to remain employed by the RBA and just go along with the code, which is really eventually, which will be to tell lies to the public in order to protect the system, because if you have your finger in the dike. And then there are other people who are going around like you and others saying, well, there's another crack here in the dike, and look, there's another crack over here. And really, they don't want to hear that. But your choice is, if you're listening to this, is do something about it. I mean, resign. And if you can, depending on your whatever contract you've signed, bring the information to the public, alert the public to what may be coming, so that it moves up the national agenda. But it certainly wasn't over here, as you know. As I said the last time, people like me and others were being attacked by the establishment, led by the Prime Minister, personally attacking you for pointing out the bleeding obvious that, we don't have this. It's not different this time. There are problems. There are very severe problems, and it's utterly unsustainable. It's just pure logic. I mean, you can't just keep doing this and expect that it's not going to blow up in your faces, because somehow you've got the magic formula that has never been found by any other economy in modern history.
Yeah, well, of course, people keep saying Australia is different. We've got this wonderful resource base, etc., and then they forget that half of the economy is to do with consumers, and consumers are now spending a whole lot less. So, that's not going to work. And I think the other point, just to re-emphasise, and it's something which people I think forget, in Ireland, right, the early signs were there in 2007, 2008, and in fact, the international situation hit then. But it was 2 to 3 years later, wasn't it, when it really all, came to a grinding halt?
Well, it was, and in those in the shall we, if you bring it back to the volcano example, the volcano was smoking, and the tribal leaders were telling the natives that this is just, God is a little bit unhappy with some of the things we're doing. All we have to do is modify our behaviour, and it will stop smoking. Whereas those using science were saying, well, actually, this is building towards an event, and these are the escalating examples of why that is inevitable, and we need to do something about it. And that's just human, of course, of human history when these things happen. So there was plenty of evidence. If you wanted to look for it, you wanted to focus on it, and you wanted to stitch it together, it was all there. And it right up to the point of when, as I call it, the comical Ali moment, if you recall him on the outskirts of Baghdad as the American tank appeared in the background, was still in complete denial. We had lots of comical Alis over here, completely in denial, leading economists with the banks, making the same sounds, the establishment making the same sounds, the government making the same sounds, up until it became completely undeniable that we had a major problem. And then the events, as you rightly describe, kept getting worse. We probably hit the worst year around 2012 and 2013. No sign of any real recovery, and then we pulled out after that. But remember, the Irish recovery wasn't a localized story. I mean, the Irish recovery was surfed the wave of international quantitative easing organised by the nexus of central banks. So we benefited enormously from that, plus the fact that we've a lot of trading with the United States, obviously with Europe as well, and with Britain, and but especially our foreign direct investment side. It was helped by the lead economy out of the problem that took the most aggressive steps earliest was the United States, and that helped us no end as an open economy. Now, local politicians would argue that it was their genius and wisdom manoeuvred us through the event, and our ability to take the lash of austerity from those that had the whip hand. And there's some truth in that, but really it was to do with the global rescue. If that didn't happen, I'd hate to think about where we would be today.
Yeah, well, it's quite interesting. We have the next indications of probably a cut in interest rates because the inflation was much lower than expected. And we had one economist coming out today to say, well, that's great because the Reserve Bank will cut interest rates by 50 basis points. That will free up the market. That will then stop the housing crash. Everything will be wonderful again, right? So we've got, again, all these people just preaching the gospel of everything's going to be fine, don't worry, despite the fact that all of those leading indicators that we're looking at just keep getting worse and worse and worse. And it's also worth, if you look at the US, the GFC there, they had, again, a 3-year lag between it all going wrong and the defaults really rising, right? And a lot of people here are saying, well, the defaults are so low, there's no issue. I want to say, well, remember that those defaults were low and they stayed low until they didn't, until they weren't low.
That's right.
And then they suddenly took off. So the expectation has to be that we're going to see mortgage defaults rising ahead, but it's not necessarily going to be tomorrow afternoon. It could be 2 or 3 years down the track simply because of how long it takes for all these mechanisms to wind through. So,
exactly.
We have to take a longer term view, I think.
Yeah, it's like a build-up of the forces behind a tsunami. I mean, and suddenly it's on the horizon, and you can see it, and then now everybody's a believer. But up until then, it's the opposite.
Yep.
I mean, we had the same thing over here, Martin, and it wasn't until it appeared on the horizon, literally until the Troika had arrived and were photographed walking around the streets of Dublin. There's a famous photograph of one of the Troika officers passing somebody who was begging in the street, and it just captured the moment that the bankers, the international bankers, had arrived to take over the running of the country. Which happened for a number of years, and it was a national humiliation over that period. It was chaotic, and they were just terrible events. But that was on the national scale. On the individual scale, things were happening throughout small business owners, and families in Ireland that were just appalling, and the level of support for them non-existent, and the doctrine that was being pushed through the media was very much about moral hazard and the concept that those that got into debt needed to be punished, needed to feel the wrath of divine providence on their backs, until it became obvious that it was their next door neighbour, and then it was them, and then people started to soften their cough when that became clear. And the scale of where it reached was phenomenal. I mean, there was hardly a household in the private sector in Ireland, especially in the SME sector, that wasn't heavily hit by this. Unlike the United States, and very like Australia, most Irish prosperity was built on the back of rising property prices. And falling property prices turned leveraged balance sheets upside down at a rate of knots. It was too late to sell at that stage to get out because there was no buyers. We had ghost housing estates that were unsellable. You couldn't give them away because it needed bank finance to finish them out, and there was no bank finance. The interbank market in Europe was non-existent. It was all gummed up. And really, it wasn't until we got the international central bank coordination and ECB action throughout the Eurozone, etc., that the rescue came in. But during that period, in Ireland and elsewhere, there was a huge level of denial. But people were just denying the scale of the issue. And the same was in the States. I mean, that the original TARP rescue of the United States was very modest in comparison to the amount of money that was actually created out of nothing in quantitative easing over subsequent years. If I recall correctly, the American national debt at the start of all this was around 10 trillion, and at the end of it had doubled to 20 trillion over the period. So the original TARP program, I think, was $700 million, so to put it into perspective. So from an Australian perspective, if you're in Australia and you're saying, well, we're all right over here because we've all of these commodities, well, that's fine, provided you've international demand. But if indebtedness breaks out, mass indebtedness breaks out in the Australian economy, it's going to have serious knock-on effects throughout, and there isn't going to be a safe place to hide. And you will benefit, of course, from international trade and all the rest of it. But the problem is that when property markets burst, and banks go with them especially, you're looking at 6 to 8 years of pain before you begin to see light at the end of the tunnel. So 6 to 8 years. There isn't going to be a bounce out of it. And I remember at the time, because I was going around talking at charity events throughout 2006, 2007, 2008, being hissed at by at those events when I was bringing up some of this kind of material, and of course the construction and developer class were the wealthiest people in the country at the time, and they were also the most indebted, and they just didn't want to hear. But then you got the start of it, as you're seeing over in Australia, where half-finished developments are not being finished. Development finance may not be there. External capital is moved out. Sale prices are falling in the, shall we say, the marginal marketplaces. They haven't filtered into the same level yet in the strong locations that'll weather all types of conditions. Watch that space. That will happen eventually. And there's a feeling of well, it's not going to happen in my locality or in my part of the economy. We're okay here. And that's untrue. In Ireland, the only safe place was probably a job in the public sector because of the strength of the trade unions. And they managed to pull up the drawbridge and pull all their people behind, about 15% of the workforce, behind the drawbridge and safeguard them. But everybody else was thrown to the wolves. And unfortunately, the scale of job losses, self-employed firms destructing without any, unemployment benefit, emigration, and so on was just catastrophic and very, very damaging to the to families throughout the country. So that's why I would say that, I'm deliberately not trying to create a picture of, all doom and gloom, and we got out of it. But my God, if we could just go back in time, knowing what we now know, we would do it so differently. We would have brought in emergency measures immediately to upgrade our insolvency arrangements, resourced it properly, and we would have really beefed up the budget for mental health services, so that when families get into crisis, that they're getting both support, they're getting financial expertise, and also they're getting counselling expertise to deal with the outcome, and that the discussion that takes place in the media is moderate, it's balanced. And we don't listen to the extreme voices, which rise when these things happen, especially the voices that regard indebtedness as a punishment on the people. And you usually find behind all those voices people that really aren't themselves taking any pain.
Yeah.
On the other side, the delusion, which, I mean, if the vast majority of the establishment in Australia are themselves, after building up their balance sheets on the basis of rising property prices and have a lot of loans, well then if I was debating with an economist from a bank on a main radio or television channel, I'd be asking them about their personal level of indebtedness and the level of their balance sheet publicly before I would take their comments on board, because we are all influenced by protecting our own position. And that's so obvious. I do know from talking to those that had been involved in the insolvency area. I was lecturing one of the insolvency courses at the time. That the estimate was that 1 in 4 of the Irish parliamentary representatives were in serious trouble. 1 in 4, and which is very, very high. And public servants, but I mean, the scale of indebtedness in the private sector would have been enormous, and the scale of indebtedness in the public sector would have been much lower, because the risk taking by those that, whose families were, whose salaries coming in from the state and who were being protected by trade union activity was much less, because they didn't need to take the type of risks that SME owners and people in the private sector were taking in order to build up their balance sheet for to try and generate a future for their own kids and for themselves when they retired. So a lot of people were caught out, overinvested in the one asset class, buying into the story of the constantly rising upward asset class, listening to all of that, and then finding when the tsunami hit that there was no preparation. They were just left there, and dealing, as I said earlier, with a Victorian Dickensian rule system. Where 12 years for bankruptcy and nothing between being pulled into civil court and bankruptcy, just continuous punishment. And we still have that today. We have families today that haven't gone into bankruptcy, cannot access the existing insolvency arrangements, and are just being pummeled all the time by the legal agents of banks, and typically investment funds that have taken over the bad loans from the banks and are now just in the process of asset stripping and clearing out. It's very, very ugly. It's very, very stressful, and it's avoidable. A lot of it is avoidable.
Yeah, and I noticed that a decade on from the first part of the crisis, that some of the banks in Ireland are now selling off those loans, those bad loans. Right? There was an announcement a few weeks ago, I think, that another deal had been done.
That's correct. The great difficulty, though, bringing it back down to a family level, is that the mother and father of the family who typically have signed these loan agreements and have these properties, they continue to hold them in their own name, not really, and they're emotionally attached to them. And it takes many years for them to emotionally accept that actually they don't own the properties anymore. They're just a proxy for the bank. The bank are leaving them in place until such time as asset prices have risen to a point where they can now go and foreclose. Yep. And all of the stuff that happens between the day they got their first letter 10 years ago and the day that they lose the property finally to the banks is just theatre. The banks play that game, and where they're constantly coming in and nipping and looking for more from you. You get an increase in salary, they want a percentage of that. You have to consistently sign these statement of affairs back in any time you want to re-engage. There is a pernicious examination of your lifestyle spending, looking over your shoulder. How can you cut here? How can you cut there? And it's open-ended pain until such time as those that are applying the pain decide, well, now it's in our interest to foreclose and to take the property and sell it and get our money back. And thank you very much for acting as our proxy for the last decade and putting up with all of that psychological stress. Thank you very much. You've done a great job. Now bugger off. And that's how it works. Yep. Unfortunately, it's very ugly, and and it is avoidable by getting the balance right in the process.
Yeah, no, I think that's very good advice. And of course, the banks look after themselves, and their shareholders, not really the customers, not the individuals. So effectively, the question is, well, who is actually looking after the interests of the individuals and making sure that there is some protection and some balance in the systems and processes. And I have to tell you that in Australia at the moment, I know of cases where the banks have effectively said, well, we won't foreclose on you because that will create a bad debt on our balance sheet. But what we'll do is we'll make some adjustments here so that you can keep paying the loan for a bit longer. And they string them along, and of course the loan superficially looks okay. So the banks are able to continue to report extremely low levels of difficulty, and yet we know of cases now, and people keep coming and telling us more of examples where they are effectively just kept on this string, for months and years and years and years, until, as you say, something changes, and then the bank perhaps changes its attitude. It's really an amazingly shameful situation, I think.
It is, and snap. I mean, you've just described exactly how the opening was over here, where the bank's initial positioning with the distressed borrower was, we're in this together. You and I, we're in this together. Yep. We're like two people in a stream that were drowning. And if we just hold each other up, and so I'll hold you up and you hold me up, because both our interests are aligned here. And that is true at the outset while they're massaging the figures on their balance sheets, because there's executive bonuses. There's a lot of stuff riding on this, including paying. You will find, by the way, when the balloon goes up, that the largest level of indebtedness, relative to salary and so on, will be by bank staff, especially senior bank staff. They'll have loaded up on credit like drug dealers, addicted to their own product. And so that's the initial phase, and then once it suits the banks, then they'll drown you, right? So you're holding on in the middle of the stream, and finally you'll feel the pressure coming on your head, and you're going under the water. Well, that's the bank deciding, right? It's me. I'm going to save myself now and drown you. You've kept me going for as long as I needed you, and your use now is being terminated. So I think that. If I was to summarize it for those that might be in a position to influence policy, is look at the insolvency infrastructure in Australia, look at how could it cope with a mass insolvency event, look at how could the creditor-debtor balance be reassessed, and most particularly, I would resource up special courts with judges who are specialising in dealing with these issues, so that the public get to understand that there are specialist judicial overview of the process. And what that does is that it tells the public that those that come through and get reasonable outcomes are good people, with good stories that stood up through proper independent judicial examination through the process, and that the chancers, because they'll always be put up by the moral hazard brigade, saying, well, these are just people who are what they call strategic defaulters. And we had this great debate about, well, who's a strategic, everybody is a strategic defaulter, but they're not, Most people desperately try to hold on to their homes, will do anything to pay down their debt, are very honourable. But unfortunately, there are those that aren't, and they will be used as examples to beat everybody else. So the way through that, I think, is to have specialist insolvency court, that with judges prepared and all of the infrastructure around an insolvency court prepared, And that's where you could bring in your psychological counsellors and so on, so that you give people assistance when they need it most in their lives. And the payback, if you do that, if you put that investment in, the payback will be huge down the road, because it will get these people back on their feet again. Because the worst thing that you can have in a society is a very large minority that are out on the fringe of society in the wilderness, deemed as non-participants until their period of punishment is out of the way, and then brought in as kind of second-class citizens with no access to credit because it's their fault they got themselves into this issue. That's the worst outcome. The best outcome is to see this as something that has happened. Lots of mistakes were made nationally and personally. Let's forgive those mistakes. Let's deal with the issues that arise and get people back on their feet, back performing again as normal members of society, having learned a great deal from the process. That's the way to do it. Unfortunately, what you will find, as we found over here, you'll have voices on the extreme right that want to use, let's punish them, divine providence, and then voices on extreme left that just want to just nationalise everything and give houses away for nothing and print money as if it was as if the continuation of printing money out of nothing wasn't going to lead to greater catastrophe. So it's very, very hard, but it's a road that must be done, where the voices of the middle, the moderates, are listened to very, very carefully. Those that are giving nuanced solutions. But unfortunately, until the events are on the horizon, the main political leaders aren't going to, politicians are in the business of winning public popularity contests, and it would be very difficult for a politician to stand up right now and say, look, we've got a major problem coming, and this is the scale of the problem, and by the way, vote for me. That's not going to happen. But those that are involved in policy setting for them in the background, they can be organising their plan Bs now and having the discussions with senior civil servants and those on the mental health side of it as well, to look at, well, we do have a plan B, we just didn't tell everybody about it, it's here. At least we're starting from something that we've thought about, rather than waiting for the events to arise.
Eddie, I really appreciate your time today, and that's been, I think, a very, very important message. Particularly, of course, we're in an election cycle here, so over the next 2 or 3 weeks, people are going to be making political judgments as to who to back. It's interesting that neither side of politics is prepared to discuss this issue as part of the campaign. It's too high risk, right? So everyone's going round it at the moment. But that doesn't actually negate the need to be planning and thinking and essentially laying plans for what may lay ahead. So thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Very welcome, Martin. Wish you well. Talk soon.
Yeah, look forward to it. Thank you.
Bye-bye, Martin.
Cheers. So there you are, a very important set of messages from Eddie Hobbs. And I think there's a really important warning sign here in Australia that we are really not yet accepting where we are, and that decisions need to be taken now to prepare for what may be laying ahead. The alternative is simply to close our eyes and hope for the best and sweep up the mess afterwards. But as you heard, when Ireland did that, it hit households very hard. It took many years to recover. I do think we have a window of opportunity to do better here in Australia. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you again next time.